I'm Claire, 32, living in a quiet Midwestern town not far from my parents' house and my younger brother Ethan's apartment. From the outside, our family looks picture perfect. My parents, Margaret and Dennis, are known for hosting elegant community dinners where neighbors praise their generosity and flawless manners. People in town often say things like, "Your parents are the kind of couple everyone admires," and they mean it. When it's just us, though, the atmosphere changes. Margaret has a way of slipping in sharp little remarks about my career and the fact that I'm single. She never raises her voice or says anything obvious. It's always a quiet line that lands when no one else can hear. If I mention it later to a relative, they act like I'm imagining things. Last Thanksgiving was a good example. I arrived on time with a homemade pumpkin centerpiece for the table. Before everyone sat down, Margaret quietly replaced it with a store-bought bouquet and pretended not to notice my reaction. She had already rearranged the seating so that I ended up at the far end of the table, practically in the corner. When I hesitated, Dennis jumped in with a light joke to keep things moving, making me look dramatic if I objected. After dinner, while I helped clear the dishes, I caught a low laugh from the kitchen. Margaret and Dennis were laughing about my need for attention, like it was some big joke. I froze, just listening while they carried on, as if mocking me was their private entertainment. Ethan used to be my closest ally. We'd text through these awkward moments and share side glances across the table. Lately, he started joining in on the dismissive tone. In the family group chat, he repeats their little digs, and when I bring it up, he brushes it off as just teasing. My best friend Julia has noticed how tense I get before every family event. One evening, after another dinner where Margaret forgot to send me the invite until the last minute, Julia said I should start documenting things. If no one believes you, she told me, maybe recordings will. I wasn't sure at first, but her words stuck with me. At the next brunch, I slipped a small recorder into my purse. It was a simple, discreet device, small enough to record without drawing attention, which helped explain how I captured clear audio unnoticed. I kept it running while we ate and made small talk. Later that night, I sat in my apartment and listened to the playback. The words were clear. My parents mocking my appearance, twisting stories about my finances, turning my life into a punchline. That first recording shocked me. It wasn't just a single cruel comment, it was a pattern. A rhythm of belittling that I'd half convinced myself I was exaggerating. The next few visits I did the same thing, keeping the recorder hidden while they talked. Each time I played it back, the pattern grew clearer. Polite smiles and compliments in public, sharp-edged criticism in private. It hit me that no one else would believe me without proof. Whenever I'd tried to explain, relatives said things like, "I'm sure they didn't mean it," or "maybe you took it the wrong way." With the recordings, there would be no doubt. I began organizing the files late at night after work, labeling each date and noting the timestamps where their comments cut deepest. Julia helped, sitting beside me on the couch with her laptop as we clipped the clearest sections. We talked about how to present it without changing context. The idea wasn't revenge, it was about finally being heard. A few weeks later, Margaret announced a big family reunion. She wanted extended relatives and even some neighbors to come together at a lakeside community hall. As soon as I heard the plan, I knew this was the moment to show everyone what I'd been living with. I didn't tell anyone except Julia. We kept the plan quiet and simple, a playlist of the strongest clips, ready to play through the hall's speaker system. I pictured the room, decorated with family photos and flowers, everyone expecting another flawless performance from Margaret and Dennis. In the days leading up to it, I stayed calm on the surface. At work, I kept my head down and my schedule steady. At night, I double-checked the files and the tiny recorder that had captured so much truth. Julia promised to be there with me, not to speak, but just to stand nearby in case things got messy. The night before the reunion, I laid out everything I'd need. Phone charged, playlist saved, a small Bluetooth adapter in case the hall system required it. I didn't rehearse a speech. I didn't need one. The recordings would speak for themselves. I went to sleep knowing that the next day would finally peel back the polished layer my parents had used for years. For once, the room would hear exactly what I'd been hearing all along. I'm Claire, and the spring reunion my mother planned came together faster than anyone expected. Margaret announced it in the family group chat with cheerful messages about celebrating family ties and perfect children. Invitations went out to every aunt, uncle, cousin, and even a few neighbors who always admired my parents. The date landed 3 months away, which gave me time to prepare. During those 3 months, I recorded everything I could. Weekend dinners, quick phone calls, even short shopping trips when we ran into each other at the market. I kept the small recorder in my bag or pocket, pressing start whenever the conversation turned sharp. Each file told the same story: friendly praise when others were listening, private cruelty when they thought no one could hear. The pattern wasn't just clear, it was impossible to deny. Julia came over many nights to help. We sat on my couch with laptops and headphones, cataloging every cutting remark. She helped me timestamp the worst moments so there could be no claim of editing or missing context. We built a playlist of short clips, each no longer than a minute, enough to land a punch but not drag on. By the end, we had a clean set that moved like a story of its own. As the reunion drew closer, Margaret filled the group chat with updates about menu tastings and floral arrangements. She posted smiling selfies of her and Dennis at the community hall where they planned to host the event, a lakeside building with wide windows and a polished wood floor. Relatives replied with heart emojis and excitement. I stayed polite and quiet, offering to bring a dessert. The night before, Julia and I met in my kitchen to review the plan one last time. She checked the Bluetooth adapter, and we tested the connection with my phone's playlist. Everything worked. I set my phone to full charge and packed the small adapter into my purse. We didn't rehearse speeches. The recordings were all the explanation I needed. Morning of the reunion, the sky stretched bright and clear. I drove to the hall early enough to see the decorations going up. Long tables lined with white cloths faced a wall of windows looking over the lake. Family photos hung on a side display, pictures of me smiling at past holidays, framed beside Ethan as kids, snapshots of my parents laughing at picnics. Their perfect image stared back at me from every corner. Margaret floated from table to table, in a pale green dress, greeting guests as they arrived. Dennis carried trays of appetizers with the easy charm that neighbors loved. When I walked in, Margaret gave a syrupy, "Our Claire finally made it on time," loud enough for the room to hear. A few relatives chuckled and waved. I just smiled and set my dessert on the side table. The first hour moved like every other family gathering. Aunts and uncles hugged me and asked about work. Neighbors admired the view of the lake. Margaret and Dennis kept the energy high, offering drinks and telling light stories. Julia slipped in quietly, carrying a small tote with the adapter inside. During appetizers, Dennis turned to a cluster of relatives and said, "We keep telling Claire to slow down on her serial dating adventures." A ripple of laughter passed through the group. I heard my name and felt eyes glance my way. I hadn't dated anyone seriously in a year, but correcting him would only draw more attention. I busied myself with refilling a water pitcher, but the digs didn't stop. Margaret moved to another circle of guests and spoke just loud enough for me to hear. "Remember when Claire skipped Ethan's birthday for a spa trip?" she said, all fake surprise. Several people looked my way, eyebrows raised. That was the trigger. I had never missed Ethan's birthday. I caught Julia's eye across the room and gave a small nod. She set down her drink, pulled the adapter from her tote, and moved toward the speaker system near the wall. While relatives lined up for the buffet, she connected the Bluetooth and tested the volume with a short chime. No one noticed over the chatter. I stepped to the center of the room and waited until a few people turned to see why the music stopped. Conversation softened to a hush. "I want to share a few family memories," I said, my voice even. That single line carried enough curiosity to hold the room. The first clip played through the speakers, Margaret's voice from a brunch 3 weeks earlier. "Claire is a life failure we have to cover for," she said on the recording, her tone sharp and unmistakable. The room froze. Aunts and uncles glanced at each other, neighbors stiffened in their seats. Margaret stood near the dessert table, smile frozen as if she couldn't decide whether to laugh or protest. Before anyone spoke, the second clip rolled. Dennis's voice joined Margaret's as they joked about Ethan's weak career choices and how they'd have to keep him close to control his future. Across the room, Ethan's face drained of color. He looked at me, then at them, as if a curtain had been pulled back. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. One aunt covered her mouth. Another whispered something to her husband. No one laughed. The third clip cut through the whispers, Margaret bragging to a friend about keeping Claire humble and making sure I never get too proud. The words echoed off the wooden walls and settled into silence. Margaret finally spoke, her voice sharp but shaky. "This is out of context," she insisted, glancing around for support. Dennis gave a nervous laugh and nodded, but no one joined in. I didn't raise my voice. "These are direct recordings," I said, just loud enough for everyone to hear. "No edits, no tricks. This is what I've been dealing with." Ethan stepped forward, his hands tight at his sides. "I thought it was just teasing," he said to them. "It's not." He looked back at me and gave a small nod. A cousin spoke from the corner, saying they'd noticed odd comments over the years but never knew how deep it went. Another relative murmured agreement. Dennis lowered his eyes and stayed silent. Margaret's shoulders stiffened, then she turned and walked toward the exit. A door opened and closed with a loud click. The room stayed quiet until someone exhaled hard. Conversation started again in low tones. A few relatives came to my side, offering small words of support. Others stayed back, unsure what to do. Neighbors who once praised my parents gathered their coats, exchanging uneasy looks. Julia unplugged the adapter and slipped it back into her tote without a word. I thanked the guests who stayed near, keeping my voice steady. Across the hall, Ethan stood still, staring at the door where Margaret had gone. The reunion didn't end immediately. People drifted into smaller groups, talking in quiet voices. Some helped themselves to dessert as if normal routine might return. But the perfect image my parents had built was gone. The recordings had spoken louder than anything I could have explained. The first clip ended, and the hall stayed silent. The sound of the lake outside carried through the open windows, small waves breaking against the dock. Faces around the room shifted from polite smiles to wide-eyed stares. Margaret stood near the dessert table, her lips pressed tight, the usual polished charm replaced by a rigid smile that didn't move. Dennis gave a quick laugh, the kind people use when they hope everyone will laugh along. He said the words were taken out of context, that it must have been a misunderstanding. No one joined him. The only response was a slow ripple of whispers as aunts and uncles turned toward each other with startled looks. I tapped the screen on my phone, and the second clip began. Dennis's voice came first, low but clear, talking about how Ethan kept fumbling his career and how they might need to keep him close so he doesn't embarrass the family. Margaret's voice followed, agreeing and adding a line about making sure Ethan never moved too far away. Across the room, Ethan froze. Color drained from his face as if the words pulled the air from him. He looked from me to them, confusion sharp in his eyes. For years he believed he was the favored one, the reliable son. The recording cut through that belief in seconds. An aunt near the back whispered to her husband that so many odd comments over the years suddenly made sense. A cousin nodded, eyes fixed on Margaret and Dennis. Small clusters of relatives began quiet conversations, heads bent together. Before anyone could break the tension, the third clip played. Margaret's voice, clear and steady, told a friend over lunch that she liked keeping Claire humble, making sure I never get too proud of anything. The hall went silent again, the words echoing off the wood-paneled walls. Neighbors who had always admired my parents shifted uneasily. One couple who often attended my parents' dinners exchanged a long glance and stepped back from the group. Another neighbor folded her arms and stared at the floor. Margaret finally spoke, her voice sharp enough to slice through the silence. She accused me of trying to hurt the family's reputation, of making everyone uncomfortable for no reason. Her tone carried a hint of command, like she expected the crowd to fall in line. I kept my voice even. I said I wanted only honesty and respect, nothing more. I reminded everyone that the clips were direct recordings, not edited, not spliced. Ethan moved closer. He looked at our parents and said he had believed for years that their teasing was harmless. Now he saw it wasn't. He asked them to give a real apology, not excuses. Several cousins added their own memories. One mentioned a holiday dinner, when Margaret brushed off a serious conversation by calling me dramatic. Another recalled Dennis making private jokes at Ethan's expense. They admitted they had noticed the pattern but never understood how constant it was. Dennis lowered his eyes, his usual easy smile faded. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, hands clasped tight in front of him. The polished host act slipped away as the room waited. Margaret's shoulders stiffened. Without a word, she turned and walked toward the exit. The door opened with a sharp creak and closed with a heavy sound that filled the hall. Conversation stayed hushed as everyone listened to her footsteps fade outside. For a long moment, no one moved. Then an uncle cleared his throat and said it was a lot to take in. A neighbor murmured that the recordings were hard to ignore. The sound of the lake drifted in again, calm against the tension. Dennis finally looked up. He didn't try to explain further. Instead, he walked toward a group of relatives who stepped back slightly as he approached. He stopped, turned to the room, and said he didn't know what else to say. Then he walked out through the same door Margaret had used. People began to talk in low voices. A cousin came over and put a hand on my shoulder, saying the proof was clear and that I had done the right thing. Another aunt offered to help clean up the dessert table to keep the room from feeling like a standoff. Ethan stayed close, still quiet, eyes on the door. When he finally spoke, he told a nearby uncle that he never realized how deep the manipulation went. The uncle nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the floor. Neighbors started leaving in small groups. Some gave me quick nods of support on the way out, others simply avoided eye contact, their admiration for my parents clearly shaken. A couple who often praised my parents' generosity whispered to each other as they walked past, their expressions tight. Julia unplugged the adapter and slipped it back into her bag, keeping her movements calm and deliberate. She stayed near me, steady and silent, while the room shifted from shock to quiet conversations. Ethan stepped closer and said he wanted to stay until most people left. Together we walked toward a side table where the family photos hung. Pictures of smiling faces looked back at us, but the polished image no longer matched what everyone had just heard. An aunt joined us and said she finally understood why I had seemed distant in recent years. She promised to keep in touch and to stay neutral if things turned messy in the coming weeks. Another cousin offered a small smile and said he supported whatever boundaries I chose to set. Outside, the sound of a car door slamming echoed across the parking lot. Margaret must have returned because a few minutes later the entrance door opened again. She walked back in, face composed but eyes cold. She moved to the dessert table without a glance at me, slicing a piece of pie as if nothing had happened. Conversations dimmed as people watched. Dennis came in behind her, silent and subdued. They stayed near the back of the room, speaking only to each other. The rest of the reunion never regained its festive tone. Guests lingered in small groups, exchanging quiet thoughts. Some cousins offered to help me pack up food. A neighbor who had always praised my parents stopped by to say goodbye, her voice soft and careful. When the evening wound down, only close relatives remained. Ethan helped me gather the leftover dishes. Julia folded the tablecloths while a few aunts carried trays to their cars. Margaret and Dennis left without saying a word, their polished image cracked for everyone to see. As the last guests drifted out into the night, the hall felt different, still filled with family photos and decorations, but no longer controlled by the perfect picture my parents had built. The recordings had done what words never could, leaving the truth in plain sound for everyone to hear. The hall thinned out as the night stretched on. Small groups of relatives drifted toward the exit, voices lowered as they whispered about the recordings. Chairs scraped across the polished wood floor. The smell of coffee and leftover desserts mixed with the cool air sliding in from the lake. I stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, and the steady sound of water hitting the dock filled the quiet. Ethan followed a few moments later, his shoes crunching on the gravel path. He stopped beside me and spoke with a calm urgency, apologizing for years of brushing off my concerns. He admitted he thought the teasing was harmless and now understood how long the manipulation had been there. Two of my aunts came out soon after. They each placed a hand on my arm and said they regretted doubting me all these years. They promised to stay neutral, but made it clear they would be present if mediation or a family meeting became necessary. Their voices stayed low, but the weight of their words felt solid. Near the parking lot, Margaret stood by her car. Her phone was pressed to her ear, but no sound came from it. She glanced our way, then turned her back, pretending to listen to an imaginary caller. Dennis hovered near the hall's side door for a while, then walked toward us. He stopped a few feet away and asked if we could move past everything. His words came without any actual apology, only a suggestion to smooth things over. I set a clear boundary. I told him there would be no further conversation until he and Margaret gave an honest apology. Dennis shifted on his feet, nodded once without meeting my eyes, and walked back toward the car. Inside, a few cousins lingered by the dessert table. When I returned, they stepped closer and quietly shared their own memories of Margaret's subtle digs at past gatherings. One cousin described a Christmas dinner where Margaret dismissed her promotion at work as a lucky break. Another recalled a summer barbecue when Dennis joked about someone else's parenting in a way that stung for weeks. They each said the reunion recordings only confirmed what they had long suspected. Neighbors who had once admired my parents began leaving quietly. One couple who regularly praised their elegant dinners lipped out without saying goodbye. Another neighbor, usually the life of every gathering, walked past with a tight nod and no smile. The admiration that had always surrounded Margaret and Dennis seemed to fade with each departing guest. By the time the hall finally emptied, only a handful of relatives remained. Ethan helped gather plates while Julia folded tablecloths and stacked chairs. When everything was packed away, I locked the hall and we headed to our cars. Later that night, as I was changing into comfortable clothes at home, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Ethan. He wrote that he finally understood how long the manipulation had been happening and that he wished he had believed me sooner. He ended the message by promising to support me no matter how our parents reacted next. Not long after, Julia called to check in. She kept her voice steady and practical, reminding me that the recordings spoke for themselves. She said the truth was clear to everyone who mattered. We went over the evening's events, noting who left early, who stayed to talk, and who avoided eye contact. I drove home with a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. The highway stretched quiet under a thin layer of fog. Streetlights flickered across my windshield as I replayed the night's details. Margaret's frozen smile, Dennis's nervous laugh, the silence after each clip. The next morning, an email from Dennis waited in my inbox. It was long and carefully worded, filled with justifications. He wrote about family stress, about how everyone says things they don't mean, about how I had embarrassed them in front of friends and neighbors. The message circled around the idea of moving forward, but never contained the words, "I'm sorry." I typed a short reply. I told him I needed time and a genuine apology before any further conversation. I sent it without adding anything else. As the day went on, calls and messages started arriving from relatives. One cousin said she supported me completely and admired the way I handled the reunion. Another uncle urged me to let it go for the sake of family peace. A few aunts texted to ask if I planned to visit soon, hinting that Margaret was upset but not offering their own opinions. The family split into quiet camps, some siding with honesty, others asking for silence to avoid drama. Ethan stopped by in the evening with coffee. We sat at my kitchen table and went through the events again. He told me he had spoken with two cousins who also planned to keep some distance from our parents until they addressed the recordings. He said a few relatives were already arguing in a private chat about what the next holiday gathering might look like. I scrolled through social media later and noticed neighbors posting photos from the reunion without the usual glowing captions about my parents. Instead, they wrote simple lines about an unforgettable night or just shared pictures without words. The polished image Margaret and Dennis had cultivated in the community was already showing cracks. That night, I set my phone aside and wrote a few notes on paper, names of relatives who had reached out, a list of next steps if my parents tried to confront me unexpectedly. I wanted to keep everything clear in case they tried to rewrite the evening's events. The following days carried a steady stream of quiet messages. One aunt called to say she supported me but worried that Margaret might try to gather relatives to her side. Another cousin mentioned that neighbors had started asking questions about what really happened at the hall. A friend from town texted that people were still talking about the recordings at the local cafe. Through it all, I kept my focus on maintaining the boundary I set. There would be no discussion without a real apology. No late-night calls, no surprise visits, no sudden attempts to smooth things over without acknowledging the truth. Ethan checked in daily, sometimes in person, sometimes by text. He described conversations with relatives who admitted they now saw how controlling Margaret could be. A few said they were planning to create their own distance, at least for a while. By the end of the week, the reunion felt like a turning point no one could ignore. The perfect picture my parents had built over decades had cracked in a single evening, and the sound of their own voices made it undeniable. I understood this was only the first step in protecting my own peace, but it was a step that couldn't be taken back. The work week passed in a blur. At the office, coworkers chatted about weekend plans and spring events, while I answered emails and kept my head down. The buzz of printers and the steady hum of conversation felt strangely distant compared to the sharp memories of the reunion. No one at work knew what had unfolded, and I kept it that way. Midweek, Ethan stopped by my apartment with 2 cups of coffee. He set them on the kitchen counter and leaned against the doorway. He said he wanted to talk face-to-face about what came next. He explained that for years our parents had pressured him to stay close, to keep up constant contact, and to follow their expectations. He described the guilt that came with every decision, college choices, jobs, even small weekend plans. Hearing him lay it out in detail made it clear how long the control had stretched over both of us. Ethan suggested a small family meeting to figure out next steps. He thought it might give our parents a chance to speak without an audience and to finally take responsibility. I agreed only with conditions. The meeting had to be in a neutral location, and they needed to acknowledge that the recordings were real and unedited. Without that, there was no point. We picked a quiet cafe halfway between my apartment and our parents' house. They had a private back room with a simple wooden table and soft lighting. Ethan booked it for Saturday morning, hoping the early hour would keep things calm. He sent a short message to our parents. Dennis replied that he would attend. Margaret sent a single line, "We'll see." Julia offered to wait nearby in case I needed a quick exit. She said she would bring a book and sit at a table in the main cafe area. Knowing she'd be there gave the plan a safety net. I spent Friday evening preparing. I wrote a short list of key points I wanted to cover, direct, clear, and calm. I printed a few notes with specific times from the recordings, just in case they tried to claim confusion or misquotes. Saturday morning arrived cool and bright. I parked outside the cafe a few minutes early and saw Ethan already inside the back room. Dennis arrived soon after, stepping through the door with a subdued look, hands in his pockets. He offered a quiet greeting and sat at the table without making small talk. Margaret came 10 minutes late. She wore a crisp cream-colored jacket and carried a structured purse, her polished smile firmly in place. Her eyes, however, stayed cold as she took a seat across from me. The room settled into silence. A server brought water and closed the door behind her, leaving the four of us in an uneasy stillness. Ethan finally broke it by asking our parents if they wanted to start. Dennis cleared his throat and began with a vague apology. He said there had been miscommunications and moments of stress that might have led to misunderstandings. He avoided mentioning the specific remarks caught on tape and didn't acknowledge the deliberate cruelty. I waited for him to finish, and then calmly cited several exact statements from the recordings, including dates and times. I explained that these were not misunderstandings, but repeated patterns of private insults and false stories. I kept my voice even, leaving little room for dismissal. Margaret kept her eyes fixed on the table. When I finished, she lifted her chin and said that I was overly sensitive, that families tease, and that I was blowing things out of proportion. She refused to apologize. Ethan tried to keep the conversation open, asking if they could at least agree that the recordings were real. Dennis nodded slowly, but offered nothing more. Margaret stayed silent. The meeting ended without resolution. We sat in a final stretch of silence before Ethan stood and thanked them for coming. I gathered my notes and left the room with him, the door swinging shut behind us. Julia looked up from her seat in the main cafe and caught my eye as we walked out, her presence steady and wordless. Outside, the morning air felt crisp against the heavy quiet we carried from the room. Ethan exhaled, hands deep in his jacket pockets. We walked to our cars without another word, both knowing the conversation had settled nothing. Later that afternoon, relatives began texting to ask if the meeting had happened. Some expressed cautious hope for progress. Others urged me again to let it go for the sake of family unity. I sent only short replies, explaining that the talk had ended in stalemate. By evening, Julia stopped by with takeout. We ate on the couch while I recounted the cafe meeting. Every detail from Dennis's vague words to Margaret's refusal to look me in the eye. She listened without interruption, then nodded once, her expression telling me she understood that nothing had changed. Sunday passed quietly. I worked on a few projects, went for a long walk, and ignored the steady ping of group messages as relatives debated what the next holiday might look like. Some suggested a gathering without our parents. Others said they would stay out of it entirely. Ethan texted later to confirm he planned to maintain some distance for now. He said he would keep communication with them to basic updates until they acknowledged what had happened. The week ahead unfolded with a strange normalcy. At work, meetings and deadlines filled my days, but the cafe conversation replayed in small flashes. Every time my phone buzzed with a family message, I let it sit. Margaret never reached out again. Dennis sent a brief email midweek, a few lines about hoping we could move forward without lingering on the past. I didn't reply. By Friday, I realized the meeting had served its purpose even without a formal apology. The truth was on record, and the boundaries were clear. Margaret and Dennis had chosen not to change, and that choice belonged to them. Ethan visited once more that weekend. We sat on the porch with coffee and talked about upcoming plans that had nothing to do with our parents, summer hikes, a possible trip, simple things that felt like a fresh start. The confrontation at the cafe hadn't fixed anything, but it left no doubt about where we all stood. The line was drawn, and everyone in the family could see it. Ethan and I left the cafe side by side, the sound of the door shutting behind us sharp in the quiet morning. The meeting had ended with no real progress, and the walk to our cars carried a heavy silence. We paused in the parking lot long enough to agree on one thing: we would stay close as siblings but keep contact with our parents limited until they were ready to face the truth. That evening, a few relatives began calling. One aunt spoke softly, saying she felt disappointed in Margaret's behavior and wanted me to know she supported me completely. A cousin texted later, admitting the recordings had opened her eyes to years of subtle jabs she'd brushed off. Each message carried the same mix of shock and quiet backing, proof that the family was now split but paying attention. As summer approached, the usual chatter about holiday plans started in the extended family chat. Aunts debated whether to invite Margaret and Dennis to upcoming gatherings. Some argued that leaving them out would only cause more division. Others pointed out that the reunion had already changed everything, and that a pause might give everyone space to breathe. One afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from Margaret. The note was short and cutting, accusing me of breaking the family apart and calling the reunion a public stunt for attention. I read it once and set it aside without answering. Meanwhile, the community around us kept talking. A neighbor stopped me outside the grocery store and mentioned that church members were still whispering about the recordings. She said people were surprised but not entirely shocked, remembering moments when Margaret's sharpness had surfaced in small ways. To bring some balance back, Julia invited me and a few close friends for a casual dinner at her apartment. She set out simple dishes: pasta, fresh bread, a big salad, and the evening filled with easy conversation and laughter. For a few hours, the tension of the past weeks faded. We talked about work projects, upcoming summer events, and small plans that had nothing to do with family drama. At work, a new project arrived at the perfect time. I threw myself into the planning and coordination, focusing on steady progress. Meetings and deadlines gave my days a clear rhythm that left less room for constant messages from relatives. A few days later, Ethan stopped by with a handwritten note. He left it on my kitchen table while I made coffee. The letter was short but heartfelt, praising the courage it took to reveal the recordings and apologizing for the years he spent dismissing my concerns. He wrote that he intended to stand by me through whatever came next, no matter how our parents chose to act. Later that week, Ethan mentioned that Dennis had reached out to him privately. She believed it might give everyone a chance to gather in a calmer setting without the tension of my parents' presence. I thought about it for a moment and agreed. Hosting would allow relatives to connect without the constant risk of drama. I started planning right away. I chose a simple menu of grilled chicken, vegetables, and homemade desserts. I picked neutral decorations, soft string lights, plain tablecloths, fresh flowers from the farmer's market. The goal was to create a warm, welcoming space where people could relax and talk without worry. When the day arrived, the weather cooperated with a clear blue sky and a gentle breeze. Ethan came early to help set up tables and chairs. Aunts and cousins brought side dishes and drinks, filling the yard with the smell of barbecue and fresh bread. Relatives arrived steadily through the afternoon. They greeted each other with smiles and easy hugs, the usual nervous glances toward the driveway noticeably absent. Conversations sparked about work, summer plans, and small-town events. Children played tag on the lawn while adults chatted over iced tea. Several family members pulled me aside to say how much they appreciated the calm atmosphere. They remarked on the comfortable setting, the simple but thoughtful decorations, and the way everyone seemed at ease. A cousin commented that it felt like the first real family gathering in years without tension humming in the background. As the sun lowered, we lit small lanterns around the yard. Music played softly while people lingered over dessert. Laughter and quiet conversations stretched late into the evening. The absence of my parents was noticed but not dwelled on. Instead, the gathering focused on connection and a sense of moving forward. By the time the last relatives left and the yard grew quiet, I felt a steady sense of readiness. The night had shown that family could still gather and enjoy each other's company without constant unease. Whatever decisions Margaret and Dennis made next no longer controlled the shape of these moments. I stacked chairs and packed leftover food while Ethan loaded trays into his car. The string lights glowed against the darkening sky. For the first time in a long while, the idea of building a healthier, chosen family network felt real. The evening ended not with a grand declaration, but with the quiet understanding that life would move on terms that no longer depended on my parents' approval. On the Saturday of the barbecue, I started early, stringing lights along the backyard fence, and setting tables with simple white cloths as the scent of fresh flowers from the farmer's market drifted through the air, while I arranged centerpieces of sunflowers and wild greens. Julia showed up first, carrying a basket of bread and a stack of plates. She tied an apron around her waist and started slicing vegetables while Ethan fired up the grill. The sound of sizzling chicken soon mixed with the music playing low from a speaker near the porch. Relatives arrived steadily through the late morning. Aunts carried coolers packed with salads and desserts. Cousins brought pitchers of lemonade and trays of fruit. Neighbors who had watched the drama of the reunion from a distance came by with warm smiles and cautious greetings. They set dishes on the buffet table and wandered into the yard, admiring the setup. Children darted across the lawn, chasing each other with bubble wands. The soft clink of ice in glasses and the steady hum of conversation filled the space. People commented on how relaxed everything felt, how easy it was to talk without tension hanging over every word. Around noon, a ripple of quiet moved through the crowd. Margaret and Dennis appeared at the gate, dressed for a formal dinner rather than a casual barbecue. Margaret wore a pale blue dress with a matching jacket. Dennis followed in a pressed shirt and tie. Their unexpected arrival turned heads. Conversations slowed as guests exchanged quick glances. I walked toward them, keeping my steps even. Margaret gave a wide smile and complimented the decorations in a voice meant to carry. Dennis offered a short greeting, his tone careful. I thanked them for coming and pointed them toward the buffet, then stepped back to continue greeting other guests. Relatives watched closely as my parents moved through the yard. Margaret stopped to admire the flowers, making sure her remarks were loud enough for nearby cousins to hear. Dennis shook hands with a few neighbors, his voice quieter than usual. Several aunts came over to check in. One asked if I was comfortable with my parents being there. I told her I intended to enjoy the evening and keep things easy. Ethan stayed nearby, helping refill drinks and guide conversations so I could focus on the guests. The afternoon settled into a steady rhythm. People gathered near the grill, swapping stories and passing plates of food. Children played tag between the trees. Laughter floated across the yard, blending with the music and the distant hum of a lawnmower from a neighbor's house. Margaret drifted from group to group, her charm on full display. But when she approached me, the air shifted. She kept her voice sweet, but the silence around us made every word feel heavy. I stayed calm, answering with polite brevity before moving on to refill a serving tray. During dinner, Dennis chose a seat near the center table. He spoke in a subdued tone, mentioning that he regretted how things turned out without offering excuses. The comment drew quiet nods from a few relatives but didn't invite more conversation. I simply acknowledged his words and turned back to serving the guests. As twilight settled, the string lights began to glow against the darkening sky. Children chased fireflies near the fence while adults lingered over dessert. The sound of gentle music mixed with the low murmur of conversations and the occasional burst of laughter. Neighbors who had once praised my parents' social events approached me to compliment the evening. They remarked on the relaxed atmosphere and the simple, welcoming setup. One neighbor said it felt like the kind of gathering where people could finally breathe. Margaret and Dennis stayed on the sidelines as the night deepened. They spoke quietly to each other, but made no attempt to dominate the space. Relatives seemed to notice the shift, giving me small nods of approval as they passed. When the last guests began to leave, I walked a few people to their cars and thanked them for coming. Margaret and Dennis offered brief goodbyes and headed out without fanfare, their footsteps fading down the driveway. Back in the yard, Ethan helped stack chairs while Julia gathered plates. The lights twinkled overhead, and the scent of grilled food still hung in the air. The evening had unfolded without a single raised voice or sharp remark. As we tidied up, cousins came by to offer thanks for hosting. One aunt said it was the best family gathering she had attended in years. Another relative mentioned that the calm energy made her feel like the family could rebuild in a healthier way. When the yard finally grew quiet, I stood by the fence and watched the last lantern flicker. The night had carried its own message. Family time could exist without constant tension, and the people who wanted a positive connection were willing to show up for it. Ethan packed the final tray into his car and gave a small wave as he left. Julia stayed to help with the last of the cleanup, stacking plates and wiping down the tables until the yard was neat again. The house felt peaceful once everything was stored away. The barbecue had brought relatives together in a way that proved new traditions could replace old habits. Whether or not Margaret and Dennis ever changed, the evening showed that the rest of us could build something better. I turned off the string lights one by one, the yard dimming to a soft glow under the summer moon. The night ended quietly, open to whatever came next.